Hey guys, it's Shelby, and today I want to talk about a not so sexy topic because zero waste is a pretty
sexy, trendy topic
in the world right now, right? I think we can all agree that at least before this pandemic hit, it was maybe cooler to do. But regardless, it's still pretty cool to do in a lot of ways. You see it all over Facebook, all over Pinterest, etc., all over Instagram, for sure. The aesthetics are appealing, the simplicity of what you need to do is appealing, but the truth is, the most sustainable option isn't always the best option when it comes to zero waste. And in this video, I wanted to talk about some examples as to how that is, and just a few other things too that don't get talked about enough that are some misconceptions when it comes to sustainability. I will also say that I've been cooped up inside obviously for almost 3 weeks now, and on top of that, it's been gloomy outside for most of the last 2 to 3 weeks, and it's definitely impacting my mood. So I'm trying to get pumped for this video, but excuse me if I just don't seem as excited as I normally do. I totally feel for everybody who's working from home or anybody who's lost their job due to this. It's a weird time and a weird headspace, and this video isn't going to necessarily be super uplifting and positive, but hopefully you'll at least learn something new, and that'll be a good thing for the day. So with that being said, we will jump into it right after I give a huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and continuing to support my channel during this time when a lot of brands are backing out, and so many of you know that sponsors are essential for creators to do what they do here on the internet, so having Squarespace in my corner is a really good thing. So if you are in the market to start a blog, a website, an online store, or even if you just need a domain, make sure you do it with Squarespace with a link in the description. It'll give you a discount. All right. Let's get into the misconceptions. The first misconception you might know if you've watched my channel for a while, but it is that the term zero waste was never meant to be the consumer's responsibility. As a matter of fact, the way that zero waste is interpreted in the media and on social media itself is not the way that the term was intended to be used at all. The term zero waste was always meant to be an industrial term because, again, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that behind the scenes of businesses, they produce a lot more trash than you and I do in our own homes. So on average, for every pound of trash that you produce in your home behind the scenes before those things got to you, 70 additional pounds of trash were created by the business, by the manufacturing process, etc. So this first misconception is about the overall idea of what zero waste is and what it was intended to be, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But I'm really passionate about this issue, this misconception, because there is truly so much more waste behind the scenes that we don't see. It doesn't get talked about because it's not as obvious and easy or sexy as just saying don't use a plastic straw. My whole channel and my whole ideology centers around this idea of eco-minimalism, so buying as few things new as we possibly can to create the smallest environmental footprint on this earth. That is what my version of eco-minimalism is. So by purchasing less things have to be created, and less of that waste that is behind the scenes that is more than what you're seeing in your house is produced. I hope that makes sense. It is a little bit of a complicated thing to explain, which is why, again, this video is not so sexy and why these topics don't get talked about enough, which is what the hell I'm here for. So that's the first thing I needed to get out of the way, which I think is really, really important and kind of sets the tone for this whole video. But the first misconception is the term of zero waste and how it was meant to be used. It was never meant to be yours or my responsibility, but the responsibility of producers because they generate a lot more waste than we do in our homes. So of course, zero waste as individuals, I do think is valuable. I do think is a good thing, but there's a lot more waste behind the scenes than what you're going to bring into your house. And that brings me to the point of the term zero waste was actually meant to be for producers, like I said, but the definition of that term when it was created was for actual producers to send less than 10% of what they're producing to landfill, which means that recycling is completely considered zero waste. Now we all know, well, maybe we don't all know, but you should know that there are a ton of issues with our current recycling system, and that as a zero waster in your own home, the goal is to also minimize the amount of recycling you have because of the issues surrounding that, which I'll make a whole video on in the future. But if producers were sending less than 10% of all of their waste to landfill, it would have a much bigger footprint than anything you or I could do in our own homes. So that's the first misconception and thing that it might be helpful to understand as you go along your zero waste journey. You're going to find that there are plenty of things that come with waste that you don't personally have control over, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things you can do to make a difference even if you don't have control over the waste you generate, considering we don't live in a zero waste economy or world. But that's the first misconception, what the hell zero waste was meant to be in the first place, what the term is actually defined as, has and how you can make a bigger impact by supporting zero waste companies rather than solely focusing on having zero waste in your home. All right, so this next topic is, again, super difficult to talk about. It's not simple, it's not straightforward, which makes it not easy to explain on social media, which makes it not so sexy for people to talk about. So this misconception is that having something shipped to you is less environmentally friendly than just going to the store and buying something from a store. So the reason this is a huge misconception is because it is simple to say, if you go to the store, you're not having to have something shipped directly to you, whereas if you buy something, it's getting shipped directly to you. And the reason that is not entirely true or simple, or every single thing you buy is not going to be able to be categorized in that situation, is because things get shipped to the store from all over the world as well, you guys. And things get shipped to your house from all over the world. The only difference is that whatever you're buying from a shelf in a grocery store, you didn't see the waste behind the scenes that they unpackage at the grocery store. And you would have to do a direct one-to-one comparison in a life cycle analysis to determine which of those items actually had a smaller environmental footprint. There are actually people who take entire degrees, who have entire degrees on industrial distribution and trying to optimize which of these scenarios is less wasteful, mostly in terms of creating economic stability for these companies, in terms of using less resources to get things from place to place and optimizing their monetary benefits. I knew people in college who majored completely in industrial distribution, which I always thought was really interesting. And I personally am not a life cycle analysis expert, which means analyzing the entire footprint of a product. But I did do a lot of that in college and obviously have a lot of experience in that in my personal life currently. But let's just take this example, which is a toothbrush, okay? So say there's this toothbrush sitting on your shelves and at a grocery store, not a local grocery store, because if something is produced, manufactured locally, I do think most of the time that's going to be a better environmental footprint than having something shipped, but not always, once again, because it had to be a direct comparison. You can't know that unless you know every little detail of every little product everywhere along the lines. So say you could go to the grocery store and buy a toothbrush, maybe a bamboo toothbrush. Let's even say that at your grocery store you're lucky enough to have a bamboo toothbrush, but it's packaged in plastic. On the other hand, you can get a toothbrush shipped to you from Earth Hero, which is made of bamboo, doesn't have any plastic, etc. Let me know in the comments which one you would choose and why, because we're about to get into it and I want to know before I say this which one you would pick. So this one comes with plastic, but this one is being shipped to you. Now here's what you may not understand. Wherever those toothbrushes came from, they were manufactured somewhere, right? If you're supporting a brand like Brush with Bamboo, they do have a better sustainable manufacturing process than this other one might, depending on what brand it is. I don't know what brand it is in your store. Both of those things are manufactured somewhere and then shipped to a warehouse and then shipped either to your grocery store or straight to your house. And this one in the grocery store comes in plastic. This one's already at your house without any plastic. So if we're just considering the end of life cycle, this one's already doing better. But if you're considering shipping emissions, they're pretty much equal at this point. Nothing is shipped to the grocery store on its own. It's going to be shipped with a bunch of other products. Nothing is brought to your house with a truck with just the thing that you ordered on it. It's shipped with a bunch of other stuff as well. This one, you still have to go to the grocery store to get, whether you're going to be driving, walking, taking public transit, etc. This one's already at your house. So there's absolutely an argument to be made that whatever is shipped to your house could be more sustainable in terms of emissions. And there's also an argument to be made that the thing at the grocery store might be worth the plastic depending on this thing's manufacturing process and shipping process. There is no straightforward answer that anyone can give you unless someone has done an entire life cycle analysis between these two products. And not only does no one talk about that, but there are a lot of people out there just giving blanket statements that this or this is the most sustainable option, when in reality, no one knows that because no one has done that study. So yeah, that's just something I've always been asked about, been able to think about. I've thought about a lot in my own personal life. But again, there is no straightforward, solid, blanket answer that I can give you, which is not sexy to say because it's not easy to understand and it's not easy to explain to people. But it is the truth. So this next section has to do with whose responsibility it is to change the market, to change the way things are produced, to change consumer habits, etc. I think it's a little bit difficult to distinguish who believes that corporations and or governments should have all of the responsibility and that consumers don't have a lot of the responsibility or the power. This is sort of a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, and it's hard to say in a lot of situations, but what I wanted to just put out here into the world to help people understand my personal perspective is that I used to do a podcast, okay? So I don't really do it anymore for personal reasons, behind the scenes reasons that we don't need to get into. But during that time of doing that podcast, podcast, I spoke to a lot of people who own businesses with sustainability features. That was the whole point, to talk to sustainable business owners. And I tell you, every single time I asked one of those business owners, why do you do this? Why did you create this sustainable business? Why did you transition your business over to be about sustainability, etc.? Every single time, without fail, the answer was the consumer was demanding it. And in a capitalistic society where the production of goods is based on demand, the only way to create that demand is through consumers. So whatever you're buying or not buying is creating a demand, or it's not. Now, in a capitalist society, there's no motivation for those businesses to do better unless we ask them to, except for the government. The government can implement laws and regulations, right? But as someone who has worked in government, as someone who worked for the state of Texas in environmental regulations for a very long time, I can tell you that it takes a lot longer for those things to change in government and for those regulations to be created and imposed than it would be if we just changed consumer demand and created a demand for them to change their process. So for me, I think a misconception is that businesses have to be the leaders. Businesses have to make the change. Governments have to do XYZ for things to actually change. I definitely do not believe that that is going to happen on its own. It's going to take us making the demands for those things to happen. And in a lot of ways, that is a difference of opinion, but in a lot of ways, it's also a fact, because I've talked to plenty of business owners who have solidified that for me. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about maybe if you didn't understand that perspective, give you that perspective, because that can be a misconception a lot of times as well. These next few are interesting, and I'm going to try to make them more sexy for you, more fun for you. I don't know, I'm trying my best here, okay? The first one is that sometimes the zero waste option is not the most sustainable option. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there about this, and it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges in a lot of cases, but stick with me, I'm gonna try to explain it to you. Did you know that there are studies out there that show using a disposable plastic bag is better than using a organic cotton reusable bag? There's a Danish study and a study from the UK who have very vastly different numbers. You're gonna have to go look at these studies yourself to understand why they're so different, but it shows that a reusable bag has to be reused between 131 and 20,000 times to be more sustainable than a single-use plastic bag. Now, how the actual hell can that be? Number one, how can those numbers be so fucking different? Please let me know if you know. But number one, how can those numbers be so different? And number two, how can that even be? Well, this is what I was saying, comparing apples to oranges, right? So obviously, with every single-use plastic bag you have, it has the potential to make it out into the environment and kill sea animals, affect sea life, turn into microplastics, and have impacts on people's health all around the globe. So you're comparing plastic pollution to what they're saying in these studies is emissions. This is where sustainability gets, again, not sexy and a little bit harder to understand, that when people ask what's more sustainable, a single-use plastic bag or a reusable bag, there are multiple things to consider. Number one, what's going to end up in the environment, wreaking havoc in our environment in that way, and number two, which one has a lesser carbon footprint. The studies that show that you should reuse a reusable bag up to 20,000 times to make it more sustainable than a single-use plastic bag are considering emissions. So it takes less emissions to create a plastic bag up to 20,000 times than it does to create an organic cotton reusable bag. And there are other examples of this, of basically what you're looking at is the behind the scenes environmental cost to make something, as opposed to only the end of product life cycle, which is the plastic bag here and the reusable bag. Obviously, if you already have a reusable bag, you can use it and it's not going to harm the environment for you to reuse it. But they're saying to create new bags, it is going to be a higher emissions cost than just the single-use plastic bags. So I'll link those studies below so that you can read them, but I just thought that was a very interesting thing to point out, because looking at the behind the scenes can often show you a lot more than just looking at the end of a product's life cycle. So misconception there. Just food for thought. This next one I'm going to go through pretty quickly because I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before. You can let me know in the comments if you have or have not. But in some scenarios, actually in a lot of scenarios, if we consider the behind the scenes environmental costs as opposed to only the end of life cycles costs, in a lot of ways, plastic is more sustainable than glass. So let me know if you've heard this before, if you can take a stab at why that is. But it is, again, because of the behind the scenes cost. So number one, it takes a lot more emissions to ship things in glass than it does to ship things in plastic, simply because of the weight. I don't know the exact studies on this, but I'm sure I could find it. I got this information actually from a man who I interviewed for the podcast back in the day, who was trying to develop a recycling process for plastic aluminum laminates. And his reason for doing this was because actually you can ship a lot more things on one single truck if they are in a plastic aluminum laminate than the amount of trucks it would take to ship that exact exact amount of product in glass packaging. So another apples to oranges example, you're considering the end of a product's life cycle, plastic versus glass. Glass can be recycled infinitely. Plastic does not have that same characteristic with our current recycling system. So apples. Oranges are the amount of emissions it takes to create that product, to create that material, and two, to ship it. These are two different things you're considering. And that's why this doesn't get talked about as much, because it's a lot more complicated to understand. It makes your consumer decisions a lot more difficult to make. But the reason I think it's important to point this out is because so many consumers, you and me, don't have the choice a lot of times to make the plastic over glass example, or whatever other example it is. You are not able to make those choices. And especially right now during this pandemic, I know a lot of us are not able to make the choice to buy in bulk, etc., to do our normal routine. But I think it's reassuring to know that maybe if you're making XYZ choice, it may not be the most environmentally unsustainable choice when you consider the entire footprint of a product. So yeah, again, a misconception, but food for thought for you. And I'm gonna leave you off on one more, which is not sad or anything that you have to think about too hard. And I'm gonna ask if you guys have ever heard of this one before. So let's go to that. All right, so this one is really interesting, and I think a lot of people don't know this, but I recently, oh God, it's not recent at all, Shelby, what? This video is not recent. I posted it probably like over 6 months ago at this point, but I still get comments on it nearly every single day because it continues to grow, interestingly enough. But in that video, I talk about what my morning routine would be like in the year 2050 if we don't do something about climate change. I essentially copied this video from Kristen Leo, who made this video and made her morning routine. It was an amazing video. She's so fucking creative, so I'm gonna have her video linked below as well as mine. In that video, I talk about how there aren't that many trees left because we've basically cut down all of them for production, etc. And it's so funny how many people in that video point out that if there were no trees, there would be no oxygen. But here's the misconception in that, if you didn't know. Life forms in our ocean actually produce more oxygen in the globe, on the globe, than trees do. Most studies I've seen since I learned this back in college, organisms in our ocean produce up to 70% of the oxygen that makes up our atmosphere, which is obviously more than trees. This doesn't really impact your life at all, and obviously trees have a lot more value than just the oxygen they produce in terms of like entire ecosystem health. So this is in no way saying we could just chop down all the trees and we'd be just fine. No, I'm definitely not saying that, but it is a misconception that trees provide most of our oxygen when that is in fact not true. And I thought it would be a fun thing to leave you off on in this video after giving you a lot of food for thought with the other misconceptions. This one you don't have to do anything about, it's just a fun fact to know. Okay, well, I am super looking forward to your thoughts on all of these in the comments, whether you have a different perspective, whether you knew this, whether you learned something new. That is always my goal, to impress you enough with new knowledge that you leave a comment on my videos. So I'll talk to you guys down in the comments, and I want to give another huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, because this content right here would not be possible without my sponsors during this time. So let's hear a little bit about them. Like I said, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform, so you can look to them to build an online store, website, or even just if you need to purchase a domain. Squarespace makes setting up a website super easy because you don't need to learn coding. They already have some beautiful templates over there that you can customize to be exactly what you're looking for. Squarespace makes it easy to connect your social media and to also take advantage of their blogging tools. You can do email campaigns through Squarespace because it is an all-in-one platform, like I mentioned. With their 24-hour customer service and traffic insight tools, it makes it the easiest way to build a website on the internet today. So when you're ready to launch, head over to squarespace.com/Shelbizleee for 10% off of your first purchase.